It is the morning of August 24th, 79 AD. A woman named Rectina is standing at her window in a villa near the Bay of Naples, looking at the mountain. Something is wrong. For 4 days now, the ground has been shaking, not violently, not enough to break anything, just enough to notice. Her neighbors have stopped mentioning it. Earthquakes are common here, everyone knows that. You feel the ground move, you wait for it to stop, and you carry on. But today, something is different. There is a sound coming from the mountain, a deep rumble that does not stop, and the air has a smell she cannot place, sharp, metallic, wrong. She sends a messenger to Pliny the Elder, the commander of the Roman fleet stationed across the bay. She asks him to send ships. She will never see the reply. What you are about to hear is the story of a city that had 17 years of warnings and rebuilt itself instead of leaving. Not one warning, not two, 17 years of the ground shaking, the wells running dry, and the animals dying for no apparent reason. And they did not just stay, they doubled down. They poured money into new buildings, they expanded the bathhouses, they upgraded the arena. By the end of this, you will understand exactly why they stayed, and it will change how you think about every warning you have ever ignored in your own life. To understand why Pompeii died, you first have to understand why anyone lived there at all. Pompeii in the 1st century AD was one of the most desirable places to live in the entire Roman Empire. It sat on the Bay of Naples, surrounded by some of the most fertile farmland in the Mediterranean. The volcanic soil around Vesuvius grew grapes, olives, and grain at a rate that made farmers wealthy. The harbor connected Pompeii to trade routes stretching from Egypt to Spain. By 79 AD, Pompeii was home to roughly 20,000 people. It had an amphitheater that seated 20,000 spectators for gladiator fights. It had public baths with heated floors and cold plunge pools. It had fast food bars on nearly every street corner, serving hot stews from terracotta pots built into stone counters. It had a forum, temples, a gymnasium, and more than 25 brothels. This was not a village, this was a Roman holiday destination. The wealthy elite of Rome owned seaside villas along the coast. Politicians retreated here when they needed a break from the capital. The wine from the slopes of Vesuvius was considered among the finest in the empire. And the mountain? The mountain was just a mountain, a tall, green, forest-covered peak that had not erupted in living memory. In fact, it hadn't erupted in nearly 800 years. The Romans didn't even have a word for volcano in the way we understand it. They knew Etna in Sicily erupted, but Vesuvius? Vesuvius was quiet. The gladiator Spartacus had hidden in its crater during his slave revolt in 73 BC. That is how peaceful it seemed. You could hide an army inside it. Nobody alive in Pompeii had ever seen it do anything threatening. And then came the morning of February 5th, 62 AD. The earthquake hit without warning. Modern estimates place it between a magnitude 5 and 6. For Pompeii, that was catastrophic. The city's buildings were not designed for it. Walls cracked, roofs collapsed, the temple of Jupiter in the Forum partially fell. Aqueducts that carried fresh water into the city shattered. The philosopher Seneca, writing shortly after, described how Pompeii was laid low. He recorded that 600 sheep dropped dead, poisoned by gases that seeped from cracks in the earth. The gas came below, from the magma that was beginning to move inside the mountain. Nobody made that connection. The damage was severe, but the response was remarkable. Pompeii began to rebuild immediately, and this is where the story takes its most tragic turn. The old aristocratic families who had owned the grand villas began to leave. Whether it was fear, financial ruin, or opportunity elsewhere, many of them sold their properties. A new class moved in: freedmen, former slaves who had built wealth through trade, merchants and entrepreneurs. These new owners did not just repair the damage, they modernized. Entire blocks of damaged housing were cleared and replaced with new public baths. The first new bathhouse in nearly a century was built during this period. Private homes were converted into bakeries, workshops, and fulling mills. The economy did not collapse, it transformed. But the ground never stopped shaking. In 64 AD, another earthquake struck while Emperor Nero was performing in a theater near Naples. Suetonius recorded that Nero kept singing through the quake until he finished his song. Tacitus wrote that the theater collapsed shortly after being evacuated. Between 62 and 79 AD, archaeologists have found evidence that the water system of Pompeii was repaired and disrupted multiple times. The aqueducts kept breaking. Deep trenches dug to fix the pipes were found filled with volcanic material from the 79 eruption, meaning the repairs were still ongoing when Vesuvius finally blew. Wells dried up. Springs that had flowed for generations went silent. Animals behaved strangely. Tremors became so frequent that Pliny the Younger, who witnessed the eruption from across the bay, later wrote that the earthquakes were not particularly alarming because they are frequent in Campania. They had normalized the warnings. The ground was literally moving beneath their feet, and they had decided it was just what life was like here. 4 days before the eruption, the earthquakes intensified. They came closer together. They grew stronger, and still, nobody left. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon on August 24th, 79 AD, Vesuvius exploded. The eruption blew the top off the mountain. A column of ash, rock, and superheated gas shot 20 miles into the sky. The sound took 24 seconds to reach Pompeii, 5 miles to the southeast. When it arrived, it was unlike anything anyone alive had ever heard. Pliny the Younger, watching from Misenum, 18 miles across the bay, described the cloud as shaped like an umbrella pine tree, a towering trunk of smoke that spread out at the top into branches of ash and stone. Within the hour, small fragments of white pumice began falling on Pompeii like hail, lightweight, porous stones no bigger than a fist. At first, you could brush them off. Children may have picked them up. They looked almost harmless. They were not harmless. The pumice fell continuously for 18 to 19 hours straight. It accumulated at a rate of roughly 6 inches per hour. Within 3 hours, the ground floors were buried with a foot of pumice covering them. Within 6 hours, ground floors were buried. By nightfall, the pumice was 9 feet deep and climbing. Roofs began to collapse under the weight, not from fire, not from lava, from the sheer mass of lightweight stone accumulating above. This is when people started dying. The first victims were the ones who stayed indoors, believing the roofs would hold. They did not hold. 38% of the bodies found in Pompeii were buried in the pumice fall layer, most of them inside buildings crushed by collapsing ceilings. Those who tried to flee faced total darkness. The ash cloud had blacked out the sun. In the middle of the afternoon, it was darker than the deepest night. People tied cushions to their heads with strips of cloth to protect against the falling stones. They held oil lamps. The lamps barely cut through the ash-filled air. Pliny the Younger described the scene from across the bay. The sea had pulled back from the shore. Buildings shook so violently that they seemed to be rocking off their foundations. The air smelled of sulfur. And then came the discovery that changed everything archaeologists thought they knew. In 2025, excavations in the house of Hell and Phrixus uncovered the remains of a family who had barricaded themselves inside a bedroom. They pushed their bed frame against the door to stop the volcanic debris from entering. 4 bodies were found inside, including a child. Gabriele Zuchtriegel, director of the Pompeii Archaeological Park, said simply, "They did not make it." At around 1 in the morning on August 25th, the eruption entered its second phase. The column of ash and debris had grown so heavy that it collapsed under its own weight. Instead of rising, the material began falling down the sides of the volcano. This created pyroclastic surges, superheated avalanches of gas, rock, and ash that moved at over 100 miles per hour at temperatures reaching 250 degrees Celsius. The first surge hit Herculaneum, 3 miles closer to the volcano. Everyone still alive in the town died instantly, not from impact, from heat. Their blood boiled inside their bodies. In the 1980s, archaeologists found 300 skeletons huddled in the boathouses along the seafront. They had been waiting for rescue that never came. Between 6:30 and 7:30 in the morning on August 25th, the surges reached Pompeii. Anyone still alive in the city died in a fraction of a second. For 200 years, every scientist, archaeologist, and historian assumed the same thing. Pompeii was killed by the volcano, the ash, the heat, the pyroclastic flows. In 2024, a study published in Frontiers in Earth Science changed that. A team of Italian researchers found evidence that a major earthquake struck Pompeii during the eruption itself, not before it, during it. Specifically, during the moment when the eruption shifted from its first phase to its second, when the volcanic column began collapsing. They found a building that had collapsed not from the weight of pumice and not from the heat of pyroclastic flow, but from seismic force. The walls had been shaken apart. The bodies inside showed crush injuries consistent with a building falling on them, not with heat exposure or asphyxiation. This means something devastating. These people had survived the first 18 hours. They had endured the darkness, the falling stones, the collapsing roofs. They were still alive when the worst of the pumice fall was over. And then the ground shook one final time, and the buildings that had sheltered them became their tombs. Pliny the Younger, writing from 18 miles away, described earthquakes during the eruption that were so violent, everything seemed not merely to be shaken, but overturned. At dawn, he wrote their carriages would not stay still, even with rocks wedged under the wheels. If that was the intensity 18 miles away, the shaking at Pompeii would have been catastrophic. The famous plaster casts of Pompeii tell the rest of the story. In 1863, archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli realized that the hardened ash contained hollow cavities where human bodies had decomposed. He poured liquid plaster into the voids and created casts of people in their final moments. A mother clutching her child, a man covering his face, 2 people holding each other, a dog still chained, twisted in agony, trying to pull itself free. One woman was found clutching jewelry and coins. She had packed her valuables. She was trying to escape. She almost made it. Gladiators were found in their barracks, still wearing iron shackles on their legs. They could not run. They were not given the choice. Over 1,300 bodies have been recovered so far. Archaeologists estimate that is only a fraction of the dead. 1/3 of the city has never been excavated. Here is what nobody tells you about Pompeii. People came back. For 2 centuries, the accepted story was simple. Vesuvius erupted. Pompeii was buried. The city was lost until it was rediscovered in 1748. The end. In August 2025, archaeologists published research proving that is not true. Survivors returned to the ruins, not just to loot, to live. In the southern quarter of Pompeii, Excavations uncovered evidence of two distinct phases of reoccupation. The first began within decades of the eruption and continued into the 3rd century. The second lasted from the 4th century until a second eruption in 472 AD finally drove the last inhabitants away. They built makeshift homes inside the half-collapsed ruins. They constructed bread ovens out of Roman cisterns using recycled tiles and bricks. They dug wells through the ash to reach groundwater. They buried their dead, including a newborn, in the ruins. A ceramic lamp decorated with an early Christian symbol dates the occupation to the 5th century. A coin bearing the face of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, dated to 161 AD, proves someone was living in the ruins within a single lifetime of the disaster. Gabriel Zutrykel, director of the site, said it was not a city anymore. It was a precarious, gray, populated area, a kind of campsite with shacks sprouting up amongst the still recognizable ruins. Previous archaeologists had found traces of this reoccupation, but swept the evidence away. So eager were they to reach the preserved 79 AD layers beneath. And here is the detail that should keep you awake tonight. Vesuvius is not extinct. It has erupted more than 30 times since 79 AD. The last eruption was in 1944, during the Second World War, when it destroyed the village of San Sebastiano and damaged American B-25 bombers parked at a nearby airfield. Today, roughly 700,000 people live within the danger zone of Mount Vesuvius. 3 million live in the greater Naples area surrounding it. The Italian government has an evacuation plan, but it relies on at least 2 weeks of warning from seismic monitoring. The question is whether that warning, if it comes, will be taken seriously, or whether it will be dismissed the same way the people of Pompeii dismissed 17 years of trembling ground. Pompeii did not die because a volcano erupted. It died because 17 years of warnings were not enough for people to believe their world could end. Because the fertile soil was too good, the harbor was too profitable, the bathhouses were too comfortable, and the earthquakes had become normal. Here is the question I want you to answer in the comments. If you lived at the base of a volcano that had erupted before and the ground started shaking, would you stay? Drop your answer below. I read every single one. And if this is the kind of history they never taught you in school, hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.